they got. And there were many ways that they did this. We'll take a look at a few of them here. How's it already 10 o'clock? My goodness, we are flying through this for time anyway. So one day it says, again, Jesus' time is close. There isn't much time left in Jesus' ministry. He's in the temple. He's in Jerusalem. He's going to the temple to teach every day. And one particular day, as Luke tells us, the chief priests and scribes with the elders came to him and asked him a question, trying to entrap him. What's the question they ask? Tell us on whose authority you do these things. On whose authority do you heal? On whose authority do you teach? Just tell us whose authority you are under. See, they had it all planned out in their own mind, because if he said, I have the authority of man, we've got him. If he says, I teach by God, then they're going to say, how? And they're going to have him the other way. Either way, they're going to ask him by asking them a question. What question does he ask them? Whose authority was John's baptism under? Well, you just answer this question for me, and I'll answer my question for you, and we'll be good. Well, they huddled up. They literally, what should we say? What should we do? These are the scribes, the chief priests, the leaders of the time, the elders. They're huddling together, trying to figure out their answer. And it says there exactly what logic they used. It says, discuss on us, because they are convinced that John was a prophet. We're not going to answer, they said. They answered in verse 7. They didn't know where it came from. So Jesus tells them, well, neither will I tell you. So we're still even. In the hearing of the people, this was a big win for Jesus. Even though it was kind of a draw, nobody really got a point awarded. This was a huge win for Jesus because he stumped they did to him. Plus the people who were following, they knew who Jesus was from. They were there for a reason. They believed because they had seen these miraculous things. Earshot of those same people who had come to him, and he'd just shown up. He tells this next parable. And to paraphrase it, he says, people. So he rented it out to tenants, and he went to a faraway land. And when the time came, he sent a servant back to collect his portion, to collect rent in the form of whatever the vineyard was, whatever the harvest was. What did they do to the servant? Beat him severely and send him back with nothing. And so the man sends a second servant. What did they do to the second servant? Beat him mercilessly, send him back with no rent. What did they do to the third servant that was sent? Same thing. Beat him, send him back. No fruit, no crops, no rent with him. So the owner says, well, maybe they'll respect my son. And so he's an opportunity that, hey, if the owner or if the heir to this vineyard is dead, then perhaps we will inherit it because of lawlessness or because the man is scared of us or he'll just give up, whatever their flawed logic was. Who the Pharisees, the leaders, the teachers of the law? Who was the son? Jesus. Okay. The chief priests, the leaders, the elders, the rulers, they knew who they were in the story. They knew what Jesus in this parable. So Jesus asks in verse 15, what then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When those people who, the chief priests and leaders who were there, said, he looked directly at them and said, what then is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. A psalm, a prophetic psalm from this and the chief leaders. They sought to entrap him even further. In this next passage, they tried to catch him in something they said. So they asked him in verse 21, teacher, we know you speak. Pharisees are teaching and the Pharisees are believing. If he says, no, you don't have to pay taxes to Caesar, then he's going against Roman law. And either way, gotcha. That's what their line of thought is, how does Jesus respond? He says, bring me a coin. Bring me a Roman coin. And so on that coin is a picture of whom? Tiberius Caesar, that's right. And he says, pay tribute to who's there. If it's Caesar on the coin, then you pay tribute to Caesar. You pay your taxes to Caesar. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. Remember, the Pharisees loved to tithe, right? And he'd already taught in multiple ways how they would go down to just the little herbs in their herb garden and give a tenth of one out of every 10 leaves of basil or sage or parsley or whatever it was they would give. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And what's their response? They were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. They just marveled at it. Not that they respected it, not that they believed it, not that they appreciated it, but they marveled at it because they could not catch this guy in a trap. Makes you wonder if they didn't catch other people in traps like this before. Makes you wonder if they didn't have almost a script that they went off of sometimes to try to catch people in saying things, to try to degrade them or get them to be dissipated in the eyes of the people. Didn't work for Jesus. They marveled at his answer, and they just became silent. Astonished, yeah. Just can't believe it. I don't have anything to say by it. I can't go any further. That's how they were. The last recorded, at least from Luke here, the last recorded entrapment came from the Sadducees. So the Sadducees come to Jesus. Remember, the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. They believed once you died, you were dead. That all of your blessings or all of your punishment came in this life only. That was the Sadducees. Pharisees believed something different. They believed in a resurrection. So the Sadducees came before him and asked him about the resurrection, and they gave him this hypothetical situation that was just nearly impossible ever to have happened. Sadducees also only focused on what was in the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's what they put their stock in. The rest of the prophets and the minor prophets, they read those things, but they didn't, everything that they followed had to come from the Pentateuch, had to come from those first 5 books. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So in this scenario, a woman marries a man who has, 6 brothers. The man dies before they have children. So through Mosaic law, then the next brother would have taken the woman as his wife. So that happens. They don't have children. The man dies before they can have children. So the third brother, anyway, this happens, repeats itself through and through and through till we get through all 7 brothers. All 7 brothers die, no children. And so the Sadducees ask the question, in the last day, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Again, this is just a ridiculous hypothetical scenario that's put to Jesus. And you just have to wonder, as Jesus was listening to this, he had to have just been, just, again? You're doing this to me again? I don't know. I wonder what his thought was there. But Jesus said to them, starting in verse 34, he tells them 2 things. He says, first off, you've got it wrong, Sadducees. When we get to heaven, it's going to be very different. It's not going to be marriage. There's not going to be people marrying, being given in marriage. It's not going to, the question of whose wife will she be is a moot issue. That's not even something that's going to happen in heaven. That's not the way it works. But then he says, secondly, he says, even if you go back to Moses, he even talked about a resurrection. And so there is a resurrection. You need to realize that. And he tells them a little bit about that in verses 36, 37, into 38. Now again, you have Sadducees there, you have Pharisees there. And the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, and the Pharisees do believe in the resurrection. And so don't you think those Pharisees were like, yeah, there is a resurrection. We got those Sadducees on this point now. There had to have been a little bit of that going on. And even to the point that it says some of the scribes spoke up and answered, teacher, you've taught well. Which had to have made the Sadducees upset that the scribes here were taking Jesus' side. But it says there at the end, verse 40, they no longer dared to ask him any questions. So as we see there, every question, every time that they tried to trap Jesus, they fail. Jesus responds in such a way so that the people continue to gather close to him for teaching, and so that the Sadducees and Pharisees, continue to show their weaknesses, either with each other or individually. It didn't work. It didn't work in what they were trying to do. They weren't going to catch Jesus in one of these questions. And so they were going to have to resort to different tactics to get him to be quiet. And that's the direction we're heading as we get into chapter 22 next week. Jesus, as we look at the end of chapter 20, Jesus gives them a little bit of a riddle. They've been giving him all kinds of riddles. He gives them a little bit of a riddle here at the end of 20. He said to them, "How can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.' David thus calls him Lord, so how is he his son?" Now, the answer to that question isn't necessarily given, other than we know through studies, and we know that the prophecy that David was making in that psalm, in that prophecy, he knew that the Messiah was going to be the king of earth, the king of the Christ's kingdom. He would be the Messiah. And so that's why he called him Lord, even though technically Jesus came from the lineage of David. After hearing all of this, at the very end of chapter 20, Jesus, he warns the people about the scribes. He says, "And in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, 'Beware of the scribes.'" What does he warn them about? What are the things that the scribes do? They walk around in what? Long flowing robes. They like what they look like. They got into their dress. It was important what they looked like. They wanted to look sharp. They wanted to stand out. What was the deal with their prayers? They like to puff themselves up in their prayers, right? They like to tout themselves and how great they are in their prayers. What did he say about widows? What did the scribes do with the widows? What's that? Wow, they devour widows' homes. Think about that for a second. They take advantage of people who are the most downtrodden in the weakest of potential conditions. They take advantage of them, and they devour their homes for pretense. They, it says Jesus told them, will receive greater condemnation. He moves straight from that into the story about the widow's mite. The widow's mite, just to summarize that, in the courts there were these large containers, I think 13 of them spread out. They were kind of cylindrical in nature, and people would go give their free will offerings in these containers, and they were shaped in such a way that there was almost like an echo that happened whenever people would drop money in them. And so some people would come in and pour large sums of money and make all kinds of noise, and people would even cheer and clap and get excited about that. All that money went to the priest, by the way. But Jesus saw a widow, a poor widow who put in 2 small copper coins, 2 mites. A mite would have been worth 1/100th of a denarius. Denarius, I said that right. So 1/100th of a day's wage. It was a minuscule amount of money if you looked at how much it was worth in the big picture, in the grand scheme of things. But what does Jesus say about it? He says, "Truly," verse 3, "I tell you, the poor widow has put in more than all of them." Not any single one of them, all of them combined. And why? Why was Jesus able to teach that? She gave out of her, what does he say? Poverty. She gave out of her poverty while they gave out of their abundance. She had 2. Would it have been okay for her to give one and keep one for her future? Absolutely. could have done that. She didn't choose to do that. She gave all of what she had. She put in both of those copper coins. And so to Jesus, that offering meant more to God than all of the other offerings put together. I think that's an impressive statement that Jesus is able to make. And it's hard for me, honestly, to fathom that. It's hard for me to stand here and try to teach on that in my abundance, you know. But it's incredible to think about, and it's something we should all aspire to. We should all strive to give sacrificially like this widow did. Okay, to wrap up chapter 21, we'll leave here, but Jesus begins to make some more prophecies. He kind of started this back on his way in that triumphal entry when he started weeping over Jerusalem. But here he begins to tell the people about the destruction of the temple and about the destruction of Jerusalem and even the end times, the coming of the Son of Man. He begins to tell them what to look for, what signs to look for, and what will happen. He begins to tell these Christians that, and these words would become very important to them because we know that Rome in 70 AD came and destroyed the temple. They came and destroyed Jerusalem, just as was predicted here. And so in the short-term prophecy that Jesus gives in verses, say, 5 on down through verse 24, that short-term prophecy came true about a generation after these words were spoken. But when we get into verse 25 through 28, we see this long-term prophecy also is explained to us there. There will be, verse 25, there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations and perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear, with foreboding of what is coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up, raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. He's telling people there, he's telling us there, this is what to look for when the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. If we go backward just a little bit and we think about the things that he foretells and the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, all of those things came to pass, just as they were, as he stated. And the Christians, it's interesting, the Christians were ready when Rome came and laid siege to Jerusalem. The Christians escaped across the Jordan River, and most of them did not perish because they followed what Jesus said to do. The Jews who were in Jerusalem were exterminated. 1.8 million is what the estimate was, were either killed or hauled off into slavery when the Romans attacked Jerusalem. They set fire to the temple. Now, the temple was filled with gold, and I'll be quiet here in a second. Just let me finish one more story. The temple was filled with gold, covered with gold. And so when they set fire to the temple, that gold melted and ran in between the cracks of the stones. And so Caesar ordered that the stones be toppled over of the temple so that they could reclaim that gold that was in between those cracks. So when Jesus said no stone would be left one on top of another, it came true just exactly as he said. And that's why we can go back into archaeological records and historical references to see that. All right, we're going to pick up 22, 23, 24, finish our study next week. Thank you again. I hope you have a great week.